Thank you, sir. Yes, I will correct that slightly. I'm formerly a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute,
Oh,
but that was
okay.
quite some time ago. I'm now currently principal consultant with Sustinio, and I'm also an adjunct at the Griffith Asia Institute, where I often catch up with Ian to talk about a whole bunch of things. So thank you again to the organisers for the invitation to be part of this discussion. Um, Maritime security is still quite new to me in terms of where I've focused my attention over the last 25 years or so, but it's increasingly important in the work that I do. And as I think I said to somebody the other day, geopolitics is everybody's business now. So we're all doing geopolitics. So I'll be focusing very much on the Pacific Islands region. So it will be quite narrow from that point of view, but hopefully it will add to your thinking about the whole of the region. I will start by saying that the Indo-Pacific framing doesn't sit comfortably with many of the thinkers and strategists and decision makers in the Pacific Islands region. Asia Pacific didn't sit comfortably, and Indo Pacific doesn't sit comfortably either. But that's, I can talk a bit more about that later. So let me just set the clock so that I know how I'm going for time. As we know, Pacific Island countries have within that collective, they are responsible for a vast swathe of the ocean. About 10% of the world's total ocean surface is contained within the EEZs of 23 Pacific Island countries. So increasingly, we tend not to think of these countries as small island states. They may have small populations. Papua New Guinea is something of an exception. But in terms of the real estate over which they exercise stewardship, they are better referred to as large ocean states or big ocean states. And increasingly in Pacific discourse, we use the term blue ocean continent to kind of reflect the centrality of the ocean to Pacific identity, Pacific economy, and Pacific security. So maritime security is a concept that can take many forms, as we've already talked about. So that can include hard security issues like military modernization, island building, freedom of navigation, maritime surveillance, grey zone tactics, and maritime militia. All of those are, they're not specific to the Pacific. They are common across the region. But maritime security also encompasses other topics, which we have mentioned, and I think are possibly sometimes more significant for Pacific Island countries. So they would include illegal fishing, piracy, terrorism, energy, trade, international law, irregular migration, biosecurity, climate change, telecommunications, transnational crime, and cybersecurity. In the case of sea level rise, security is sought from the encroaching maritime domain itself in numerous parts of the Pacific Islands region. And all of this is reflected or is encapsulated in what we saw documented in the Boy Declaration of 2018, where the Pacific Islands leadership came together to stipulate that as far as security goes in the region, firstly, climate change is the preeminent security threat faced by the region, but also that when it comes to thinking about security in the Pacific, we're focused very much on an expanded concept of security, with human security being very much at the forefront. And that applies in the maritime domain, just as it does everywhere else. So if we look at the Pacific Islands Forum Security Outlook Report for 2022-2023, this builds on what was in the Boy Declaration and the associated action plan for that declaration. And it highlights what it refers to as new challenges, which are linked to global economic instability and geostrategic competition. So these things that are happening in other parts of the world, as we've already heard at the beginning, they have an impact on everyone, and that includes in the Pacific Island region, which is sometimes seen as being possibly a bit remote or somehow removed from what's going on elsewhere in the world. So that report, in particular reference to maritime security, saw value in extending cooperation with what's referred to as the Pacific Quad. So that comprises Australia, New Zealand, the USA, and France. So they are seen as principal partners when it comes to maritime security in the region. But as I'll come to in a little while, they're no longer the only ones. We're seeing an increase in the partners in that space. The report confirms that the maritime security intersects with other security domains, those that were identified in the Boy Declaration. Again, climate change, transnational crime, geostrategic competition, environmental security, and human security. So if we look at the declaration plan from the Boy Declaration, the action plan that accompanies the Boy Declaration, this is what the Pacific leaders, the Pacific Islands Forum leadership wants to do in relation to maritime security. So it talks about the need to enhance capacity of regional law enforcement agencies to monitor and secure maritime borders, combat illegal fishing, and prevent maritime piracy and smuggling. Now, this is a big challenge for anybody. It's a big challenge when you have a huge segment of the ocean to do those things in, whether you're doing that on a national basis or whether you're working together as a collective. And as we see in other parts of the world, in the Pacific, these things exist side by side. So there is work being done at a national basis, but there's also work done by the Pacific Island countries as a collective. At the political level, that operates through the Pacific Islands Forum. At the technical level, it operates largely through the Forum Fisheries Agency, but there are new agencies that are coming in behind to support that. For example, the Pacific Fusion Center, which is based in Vanuatu, that's a relatively new entrant into this space. But the FFA has been around for much longer, and it's based in Honiara in Solomon Islands. And its mandate is to empower its members to take collective and national action for sustainable use of offshore fisheries within their AEZs. Across the members and the partners, there are 17 nations. Now, I think it's important to focus on fisheries for a couple of reasons. One is that the whole issue of IUU is obviously a really significant issue for these countries, particularly in terms of economic security. And the other is that what we're seeing and what we'll continue to see is that given that FFA already has an established presence and an established set of relationships and established infrastructure, that it's increasingly being used as a focal point for other aspects of maritime security, particularly when it comes to surveillance of the maritime domain in the region. So at FFA, they have a couple of aerial surveillance programs. There's one that's been in place for a while and one that's relatively new, which is referred to as the Enhanced Aerial Surveillance Program. And they also have a vessel monitoring system. So all of these things are in place, and they're largely well received. I think the biggest issue there is the resources constraint versus the hugeness of the task, which is that it's very hard to provide as much aerial surveillance as everyone would like. And there are also some issues about how the information is then shared back to individual countries and how they can make best use of that data. So just in terms of, just for those who aren't aware, the significance of the work of the FFA, in 2023, 1.38 million tons of fish were taken from waters that are governed by members of the FFA. That's predominantly tuna, and that's worth $2.9 billion. And it provides revenue to member governments to the tune of $470 million. And it supports 25,000 plus jobs across the region. So it's an incredibly important part of what goes on in the Pacific. It has very important economic impacts, but increasingly it's very politically important as well. So one of the issues that the Pacific Islands leadership has identified is this increase in the rise of geopolitics and what that means, and in particular in the maritime space. So in another with another hat on, I co-lead a project which is investigating the rise of defense diplomacy in the Pacific Islands region. It covers 5 separate countries, and we've tracked the data, that we've tracked the number of engagements that can be described as defense diplomacy over a 5-year period from 2018 to 2023. Now, within that data set, there are, I think, 13 categories of engagement, of which maritime security is one, and is relatively small compared to some of the others. But in that subset of the data, we can see that there's been a massive increase in the engagement from partners. So in 2018, we identified 1 engagement that we described as maritime security, and in 2023, that had increased to 13. So the largest contributing partner of this type of engagement over that 5-year period was Australia, followed by the USA. Now, to bring my remarks to a close, I wish to draw on some work done by my co-lead for that project, Associate Professor Anna Poles at Massey University. She presented earlier this year on the growing contest for influence, maritime security and governance challenges in the Pacific. So she makes a couple of really important points. When it comes to how Pacific leaders and the Pacific strategic community needs to be working with maritime security, it's important to recognize that this is intrinsically geopolitical. It's about power projection and resources. And this is particularly important for leaders and policymakers who are managing relationships, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, with partners that are seeking to support their work. This increased activity from partners who are looking to project presence and cultivate influence, it has increased, and we expect it to continue increasing. There's no sign of that tailing off in the short to medium term. So, for example, we've seen China register 26 Coast Guard vessels with the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, who will be making their presence felt, no doubt, in the next little while. We're seeing an increased presence of US Coast Guard vessels, and often they come with ship rider agreements. So they're spending more time in the region. They're working with more countries than they have done previously. And we will also, further to the most recent PALM dialogue between Japan and Pacific Island countries, we will see an entry of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force into the arena, which is an innovation. We haven't seen that previously. Now, all of this is not new in the Pacific. This need to manage a multiplicity of partners. It's more than it ever has been. It's increasingly complex. It does mean that transaction costs can become very draining on resource-constrained economies and small administrations. It does mean that there are the need to balance interests of particular partners. A number of countries in the region are non-aligned countries, including Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. So they are seeking to maintain a non-aligned position, and they adhere to a foreign policy based on being friends to all and enemies to none. Obviously, that creates opportunities for them, some of which they are making very good use of, but it also can create problems, and it can create the opportunity for conflict. There are also other concerns in civil society about an increased militarization of the region, which is something around which there are a number of sensitivities, particularly in countries like Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, and Fiji, and across the region more generally. We've seen most recently Prime Minister Ramboka of Fiji want to put forward this idea of the Pacific being an ocean of peace or a zone of peace, and we've yet to see what that will look like. I'm going to leave it there. I haven't talked much about the patrol boats that Ian mentioned, but I'm happy to address that further if it comes up in questions. Thank you for giving me that time.